You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where we bring you great Australians doing great things with interesting insights on how to be healthier, wealthier and wise. And today we've got a killer author, the author of Killer Thinking and another fantastic business book called Cult Status, Tim Duggan. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Brett. Wonderful to be here.
Mate, how are you?
I'm really good.
Healthy?
Good. Yeah.
The new book's out. It's selling. I see you everywhere. For our listeners, why don't we start at the beginning? Where did you grow up? How did you sort of progress through your career and then now land doing the author thing?
Yeah, so the author thing's relatively new. So let me go back to the beginning. And this is potentially a bit of a companion podcast because my brother, Chris Duggan, was on recently as well. So if people have listened to that episode, you probably get a different perspective now. You're going to hear the truth now. That was the varnished side. I'll tell you the whole truth. No, we grew up in Lane Cove, a pretty close-knit family, really wonderful family. My dad, Phil, who co-founded, started Bright & Duggan, the strata management company that my brother now runs. So grew up in Lane Cove and had a pretty idyllic childhood. One of those things looking back, like I kind of enjoyed school and I really threw myself into everything extracurricular. That was what I loved. Like the classrooms, sure, you learned some stuff. I don't think I actually got too much of how I live my life now from those classrooms, but it was all the things outside of that I really threw myself into. So cadets on weekends, debating on Friday nights, things that maybe seem slightly uncool now when you look back at it. But I just learned so many of my life skills from being forced to sit there on a cold Friday night at some school on the North Shore with two of my friends and forced to come up with an argument in an hour about something that you did or didn't believe in. And then no matter what happened, the clock was ticking and you were going to stand up in front of people an hour later and argue a point. And I just think that everything that I do now, from writing books to figuring out how to make coherent arguments, to negotiating with my husband, through to doing podcasts and public speaking, all of that I can literally trace back with a direct line back to school.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? So I was one of those weird souls who spent Friday nights debating my entire high school career,
amazing,
which I enjoyed. Interestingly, I think that a lot of people that struggled with the idea of debating, some struggle with the idea of having to speak publicly, but it requires a huge general knowledge. And so, the more you know about, the more you know, the more likely you are to be able to think about a problem put to you an hour before you have to make an argument about it. What was your thinking? My subjects were English, geography, economics, general studies, everything, physics and chemistry. So a very broad education, if you like. Was that what you found helpful, or where did the sort of, because to me, I put it down to curiosity.
It took me a while to figure out there's a difference between what you're good at and what you like doing. And for me, I actually found that I was relatively good at maths. I did 3 or 4 unit maths at school, which is, crazy when I think about it now. But I was relatively good at it, and I knew how it worked. But I hated it. And it took me a couple of years to figure that out. Even at university, I came straight out of school and went into the mailroom of an advertising agency when I was 18 or 19, because I just wanted to experience a bit of the real world. But I also decided that I was going to study Bachelor of Business at UTS part-time. And so I started doing business, and I was sitting there in my microeconomics or macroeconomics class. And I realized that, sure, I could understand these concepts, but it just was not fulfilling for me in any way. And in fact, what really I loved was English at school, history, a lot of the humanities, reading and kind of doing comprehension. Then when I went to university, I kind of figured out that I actually wanted to major in marketing and major in journalism. And that was halfway through my business degree. So luckily at UTS, I was able to kind of dial down all of those economic subjects, which I'm glad I studied them because I understand how the world works. But and
then add like a major and sub-major?
Add a major in marketing, a sub-major in journalism, essentially. Yep. And that to me is where I really found my calling. I just found that when I was writing a story, or when I was thinking about how you can take a big complicated subject and try to make it simple for people to understand, that is what really made me sing.
Okay, so you get through uni, and then what happens? Did you spend the whole time working in the ad agency?
I did, yeah. So I did 4 years of a 3-year degree that I did over 4 years. So I essentially was working full time and doing uni full time. And I kind of realized that, your early 20s, you kind of a bit invincible. What is sleep? I was going out every weekend as well as doing that. And I'm kind of glad I did now, because it's one of those things that you look back at and, I kind of fast forwarded a few years of life into a short period. So I was working at ad agencies and just having an amazing time. I kind of was at that stage where I was saying yes to every opportunity that came my way. So, a meeting at work one day, and one of the art directors of the ad agency came in and said, right, who wants to work on a short film that I'm filming this weekend? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll do that, and go and work on my first short film. And that film went on to win Trotfest that year. And then just saying yes to kind of all of these opportunities that came up. It was a really, really kind of quite amazing time. But at the same time, I was exploring a couple of things. One was my writing, which was I started writing for free street press magazines, and kind of just figuring out how to be a writer. And I realized very quickly that a writer is someone who writes. So you don't need...
There's a great quote on Hemingway, and a young person goes to him and says, great oracle, how do I become a writer? And he says, write.
Yes. Yeah. I think
There's so much in that, right? There's so much in...
There totally is. I think it was Hemingway also who said, writing is easy. All you do is open up a typewriter and bleed. And I love that. Kind of talks to the truth that you try to put into your writing as well.
Just for our listeners, if you go back and do what I did at one point, and you study who are the successful writers of the last 50 years, of the top 5 best-selling female writers, 4 of them started as secretaries, and they all wrote between 3 or 3:30 in the morning and 5:30 in the morning while they did their work. And they expressed that they had such a passion for what they did that they had to do it. And it wasn't about whether they got published, and it wasn't about whether they became multimillionaires and heralded writers, but they just had to write. And they knew that if they did it every day, that it was like a discipline, and there was no other way to do it. It's also true of the guy that wrote, I saw recently, I think on US 60 Minutes, he's just died, John Le Carre. It's a great YouTube video on him. So just as an aside, for anyone that wants to write, you have to get up early and write, and then go and do whatever else you want to do, and don't expect anyone to pay you until you get really good at it.
Totally. You do it for reasons other than money. You do it because you love it and because you have to. And so in my early 20s, I was just writing. I wrote for Rolling Stone magazine. I was one of their main contributing writers in Australia. And I just loved that idea of taking things that might not have order in them and figuring out how do you create order in this chaos. Yeah, it was just something in my brain that just kind of really made sense. And I loved it so much that I kind of became essentially a full-time freelance writer. And around the same time, I started putting on events as well. So I'd recently come out as gay in the early 2000s when I was kind of 18, 19 or 20. And I started putting on events. I
read this in an article the other day that you shared, that you went out and started doing events where you invited a whole list of people to a particular venue. Tell us about that, because I thought that was awesome.
Oh man, it was this idea that you have in your early 20s, and all of us have dozens of ideas. What the difference was that I turned it into reality, and that set off this chain of events that leads me to where I am today. And I just always look back and almost thank my past.
Tell us about that, because I thought that was very funny.
Yeah, so it was this event series that I used to go to. Used to go out a lot in my 20s. And a lot of the gay and lesbian venues that we went to were pretty daggy. They were kind of playing old music, and it was all a bit retro, and it didn't really fit myself and my friends and where we wanted to go. And yet then I would go away to all of the predominantly straight venues, and there were these amazing, beautifully built venues with like great lighting and great music. And I couldn't quite understand the disconnect between them. So I said to a bunch of my friends, hey, who wants to come with me this Friday, and let's get a big group together and we'll take over a straight venue. And we called it Fag Tag. because we were a bunch of fags going to tag a venue. A bit of a kind of like taking back the ownership of words that had been used as slurs against us. And we got a big group of us together, and within about a week or two, a couple of thousand people had signed up and said, yeah, I want to hear about this idea, and kind of built this mailing list. And so the first one we went to, we kind of took over a venue, maybe 100 people turned up at a venue that was 500 or 600 people. And then before we knew it, this kind of thing just evolved into essentially a business. And I had this mailing list of 10,000 people on there. And I would say, hey, let's go fag tag this venue here. And a couple of thousand people would turn up at a venue. And I soon realized there was a business.
The venue wouldn't know why it suddenly became so popular.
They wouldn't. It was at the start, it was quite subversive. It was this kind of like moving this mob around Sydney. And then I very quickly realized there was a business in this, which I would go to a venue and say, do you want a couple of thousand people this Friday, Saturday, Sunday? They said yes. I would say, great, I want 10% of your bar while it's on. And that simple idea and that simple kind of twist on that kind of was what I talk about in my book, which I'll talk about a little bit later. One of my first kind of like really killer ideas where lots of parties all won. And it helped me buy my first apartment. It was as well as have a lot of fun with my friends. And, you know, some almost 20 years later, the idea was originally started in 2004. It's still going in various ways.
Yeah, no, it's funny. So I see the book and I see the title, and I thought I'd explore with you this, you know, a lot of people, it's a great Henry Ford quote, you know, the hardest work of all is thinking, and that's why so few people do much of it. But I'd always thought that the hardest work of all is doing, and that's why so few people do anything. But that instance where you come up with this idea, you make it happen. Steve Jobs, you know, says that the world's constructed by people, and one day you realize that you can be one of those people, effectively, to paraphrase him. Once you realize that taking action can lead to things happening, to me, that's like the key breakthrough. But there seems to be this like massive sort of courage deficit where, firstly, I think people feel entitled and expect somebody to pay them to do it. Secondly, I always think that they're not really seeking to serve anyone other than themselves. So this is a great example of an idea that actually did something good for people. You know, here you are with your mates. You're like, well, hang on. I go to all these scungy dives. I'm not quite sure. Like, as a group, we're being treated like second-class citizens. And then we go to a bar that's like a fourth-class bar. And it's not by design. It's not like anyone ever set out to say, well, look, you know, the building code requires that all gay and lesbian venues be fourth-class venues. And they must listen to shit music, you know, on bad sound systems, which today seems so, you know, odd.
Yeah.
But, you know, to actually have the idea and then do something, I always think that the great ideas that get executed come from sort of a spirit of trying to solve a problem. And then, as you described, the sort of money just comes from that because people are happy to pay somebody that's making a difference.
Yeah.
What do you attribute it to? Like, what do you attribute? Now, I knew your dad. Your dad was a go-getter, and your mum, I think, as your dad acknowledged, is like the secret go-getter in the family, right?
Mm.
Determined and a real goer. Was it that you had the confidence having seen other people do things, or where do you think the confidence comes from?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think certainly there's a lot of privilege that comes from having a great education at a private school and having a great loving family that kind of support you no matter what. And that, I think, is the first thing to acknowledge that has been a real part of my success. And I'm so grateful to my parents and family for kind of giving me that platform. The second one is I solved a problem for myself. I wanted somewhere better to go, and it just happened to solve the same problem for thousands of other people. And that, to me, is, I always said, I'll keep doing this until I stop enjoying it. I'll keep doing this until I get bored. And that, it's almost a selfish way of thinking about problem solving, but it means that you can really intimately understand the problem better than anyone else because you've got it. And I think some of the best problems are ones that are solved internally. And the third thing, I think, is just a growing realization that, as you said, once you realize that all of these things that we think are amazing are made by mere mortals like us, it kind of breaks down the barriers and means that the opportunity, you kind of start to see it all around you. And that was something that I think was really important. And this, for me, was this just very first taste of an idea. Like, said to some friends, let's put on a party. And where that led to was then selling tickets to those parts, to some parties on a website called In the Mix, meeting a bunch of people who started that, co-founded my very first media title, which was called Same Same, which catered to the gay and lesbian community, which was built out of that mailing list that I did there. And that company then evolved, and I met my business partner through that. And then we ended up launching Junkie, which was our pop culture title in 2013. And then that company evolved into Junkie Media, which had 70 full-time staff. We sold to an ASX listed company in 2016. And all of that started because when I was 22 or 23, I had this idea and I said to some friends, hey, are you interested in this idea?
So it's interesting. So I see that you're right. You need to deeply understand an idea yourself. It's good if you're solving a problem that you yourself have. And it's got to resonate with other people. So you had a small group of friends, I take it, that was supportive and thought, those first followers who wanted to do something. Was it a small group, a large group? Who were the first people you turned around and said, hey, why don't we go fag tag this joint?
Yeah, it was all my friends. It was my friends. It was a small group. There was a real core group of them. They're the first followers. And I remember I would rope them in to come in to hand out flyers with me at venues. So we'd go to some of these old gay venues and would hand out flyers. And I actually remember one of my best mates was someone who I used to always rope in to hand out flyers. He's now the Mark Coulter, who's the co-founder of Temple & Webster, the online furniture store. And he always jokes to me that he kind of, jokes that part of my success was the fact that he came with me at midnight to hand out flyers to people at some of these scungy nightclubs. And I just love that there's this amazing kind of history there of friends who become your first followers, and then it builds out from there.
Yeah, so I always say to people that in the last 2,000 years, the most impactful person in the world is Jesus, and he had 12 mates and a bunch of stories. So it's a good place to start for anyone listening. If you have an idea and it solves a problem for you, and it doesn't need to resonate with more than 12 people. But if it does, and those 12 people are, 5 people or 3 people or 2 people that are prepared to go out at midnight and hand out brochures, it's a way, internally to take that confidence and say to yourself, hey, I might be onto something here. Because Tim, my experience is that people come to me and they say, I got this idea, but I don't have 1 million followers. And it's like, yeah, mate, you don't need 1 million followers.
Yeah.
They're thinking that it's got to be gigantic to be valid. I love how you've shared, and I think you'd love to point out to our listeners how you've shared that it's this snowball effect. It's this flywheel, the knock on of I told my mates, we handed out brochures, we built a list, the list got bigger, we got 10% of the bar. We started another title. That title was reflective of what people wanted. We did the next thing and we sold the next thing. And I guess that gets us to, Junkie Media gets sold to an ASX listed company, which I think was O Media. Is that right?
O Media, it was, yeah, correct.
Sold to O Media, which is a great story. And then you land post that transaction. I take it you do your earn out. How do you come up with this idea? Okay, and now I'll write this book called Cult Status. Where does that come from? And really worth a read, guys. So if anyone hasn't read it, worth a read.
Yeah, so it comes from a few things. As you mentioned, I was working full time at the time, and you mentioned a bunch of the famous female authors who got up early in the morning to write. I wrote my first book between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. for about a year and a half. So I got up every single morning, wrote before I went to the gym. And that was my time. And it was little by little, sentence by sentence. Some mornings I woke up and I did not feel like writing anything. And other mornings I woke up and I just kept on writing. And it was in those really personal, private, it was just me. Everyone in the world was still asleep. And that was where all the ideas started coming to me. And I wanted to share a bunch of the journeys and the lessons that I had from co-founding Junkie Media and turning it into what that was, along with I ended up speaking to dozens of people around the world. It was pre-COVID when I wrote the book, so I was able to fly over to Silicon Valley and chat to people and get on the phone to people from all over the world. And I was really obsessed by this idea of a community, the idea of there's some businesses that have really strong communities around them. And I wanted to find out how you build those strong communities. A spoiler, as one of the ways that you do it is one person at a time. So people come and ask and say, how do I build this giant community? Because they look and they see someone that has 1 million followers or someone that has 50,000 customers. And every single one of them started with one person. Every mailing list has the first person that signs up. Every customer has that first customer. And as soon as you realize that building a community is one person at a time, it just takes some of the mystique and some of the fear away from it.
Yeah. Very, very interesting.
Yeah. So I wrote Cult Status in the early morning hours, and then it came out in 2020, July 2020, right in the middle of a global pandemic. So all of these grand plans that I had for it, for book tours and launches and in airports and all those things, didn't happen. So I then took that same approach of, how do I get people to find out about this book? And I did it one person at a time. I literally kind of went on every podcast that would have me. I did every speaking gig. I did book clubs. And slowly, because people started reading it and saying, hey, this is pretty good, they passed it on to each other. And that book was named the Entrepreneurship Book of the Year at the Business Book Awards last year. So it's pretty amazing to kind of watch this little book that came out, from an unknown author in the middle of 2020, just kind of go on and find an audience of people who learn some of the lessons from it.
Yeah, fantastic. Really great story. Now, Killer Thinking, the new book. I've always thought you should spend 3 years promoting the book you've written. You've come out with this one a bit quicker. I take it it's some ideas burning in your brain. What's the mindset?
Yeah. So knowing the book process is a very long and slow process, as you would know, Brett. And you end up finishing a book about 6 to 8 months before it comes out. So as soon as I finished that book, I started thinking about the next one. So it's taken about kind of 2.5 years of kind of production time and thinking and writing and editing to get it to where it is. And it's an idea that I've been...
And in fairness, for our listeners, when you finish a book, it takes so long to get out of your head what's in the book. The book is often well finished before it's finished.
Yeah.
You've lived it, you've breathed it, and you're just trying to get it tidied up on a page that somebody can read, but in your own mind, it's well finished.
Very much so. A lot of the thinking for a book that you read and anyone picks up today, that's published today, was done 2-3 years earlier.
Yeah.
So interestingly, I narrated the audiobook for Killer Thinking recently, and it was wonderful because it gave me this opportunity to dive into every single word and force myself to read through and make sure all the concepts were just as fresh as they were as when I wrote them a few years ago. So I loved that. So Killer Thinking comes from this idea that I've been really obsessed by, how do you take a good idea and then refine and massage it into a great idea, and then keep refining and stretching that until it becomes a truly killer idea. And killer in the book is actually an acronym that stands for what I think all the best ideas in the world have in common. And that is, they're kind, impactful, loved, lasting, easy, and repeatable. And so I started this journey by going to a bunch of these ideas I just thought were really killer ideas. Some of them were business ideas. So things like Canva, democratizing design is obviously a pretty amazing killer idea. Things like Keep Cup, the idea that you can kind of like just keep, reusing the same cup over and over again. Things like Movember, where they've now raised $1.5 billion for charity by getting dudes to grow a moustache on their face in November. Things like this movement in Bogota in Colombia called La Ciclovia, where they shut down the streets of Bogota to cars every Sunday, and humans and bikes, and everyone takes over the streets. So I chased down the founders of all of these ideas and tried to speak to them and ask them, how did you come up with the idea? What was it when you started? How did you refine it? And then I took all those things and figured out that they have a bunch of things in common, which is where Killer Thinking comes from.
So for our listeners, the things that they most have in common?
Most of them are really, really simple to explain. I think that's probably the simplest thing.
Yeah.
An idea.
No doubt about software like app development. It's got to be simple for somebody.
And that's because the way that you share an idea is you tell someone else about it. And if it's complicated,
so Chinese whispers.
Yeah,
and be able to use it.
If you don't give them the tools and give them the really simple way of being able to explain that to someone else, it's just going to get complicated. It's going to fall down. The whole thing's not going to work. So I think making something really easy to understand is probably the hardest part of coming up with a killer idea. And then the other part of the book is called Killer Thinking, not Killer Ideas, because one topic that you mentioned at the start is killer thinking is actually two things. It's killer ideas and it's killer execution. And you've got to have those two things in concert. And when you do, it becomes killer thinking.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, many of the ideas that you've mentioned there, they have to be taken on by other people. And sort of when you met the founders of these ideas, they don't hold them too tight. They sort of gift them to people and let them, not so formally, but refine them, improve them, develop them. And, everyone that I've ever met that's come up with something really amazing will say, firstly, I was lucky. And secondly, it's essentially co-authored by millions of people.
1,000%. I think the most important thing is being really clear on what you're trying to do, what the idea is trying to do, the purpose of the idea, where it's going. And then you hand the authorship of that over to as many people as possible. And that's really scary for some people. It's a concept in Cult Status that I talk about that I call lead from the middle. So this idea that you set a vision, you say where you want to go, you tell people this is what I'm going to do, but then you let other people, staff, customers, figure out how to get there. And that's a way of empowering other people, making people take some ownership of it. There's a bit of what I love about the two books, Cult Status and Killer Thinking, is there's crossover between both of them because they're both almost part of the same world. And it's a world that I'm an optimist, or I believe that business can be used as a force for good. Yes,
that's why I saw the book and I thought it needs a little slipcase so you can buy them together.
Yes, I think hopefully that will come when I do my third book, which I'll talk about later.
Yeah. Okay. So you've slipped it out. You got a third one in mind?
I do have a third one in mind.
Part of a series in your mind?
The first two are part of the series, and the third one I think is going to be a slightly different style. That's kind of what's going around my head at the moment. I have a topic, which I'm kind of thinking through. I won't reveal yet what the topic is, but it's what I really try and do is take really complicated things and make them simple. And I also look around and I'm just constantly looking for what are the opportunities over the next 5 or 10 years that I can help people take advantage of. So those things are kind of combining at the moment in my head.
So if as you're going along now, are you picking up stories? Are you collating, some of the best books I've read are stories about what people have done with the work of others. And I find that really fascinating to see, there's the old standing on the shoulders of giants idea. Most people are influenced by other people and their ideas. Are you starting to collect and collate or build an archive in any way of people that are taking these ideas and using them?
Yeah, one of the favorite things I love about writing books now is I'm like a sponge. And so any piece of information I see, if it's on Twitter, if it's on LinkedIn, if it's in the AFR, if it's in the Guardian, I'll see something and I will add it to my extremely long notebook. And then I'll see people who are doing interesting things and I'll reach out to them. Sometimes it's for an interview, sometimes it's just for a chat to find out information. And it's like the other way I think about it is like I'm like a bowerbird where I kind of go and collect blue things and bring them back to my nest. So anyone I see who's doing really interesting things in any of these kind of spaces, at the moment, I just absorb as much information and then I just have to let that sit for a while. And it's in doing that, and I've done this now, this will be the third time I do it, I speak to over 50 people for each book, record most of the interviews, and then I try and figure out what they have in common. And that part is that's where the real magic happens, because you have this perspective that people only have if you have the wisdom of 50 people together.
Yeah, totally. My first book, Tim, was called Collective Wisdom. And the idea was that, if you ask enough people same questions, I asked 11 standard questions, you can look at the information that you get. And there is a wisdom in listening to people, which is interesting. Now, in those days, that was 1997, there wasn't the software that I later discovered. If you take those transcribed interviews, there's academic software that allows you to put those Word documents through it, and it starts to tag and identify common word patterns. And there's sort of old academic techniques, that are quite interesting at sort of looking at themes and ideas. That's much easier to do now through software.
That's fascinating. Are you saying software is going to take our jobs of writing and collating books?
Not at all. Somebody's got to collect that information. And what's interesting, while everyone expresses things in different ways, it's often people, there's a lot of investors now that are using AI to record investor calls with CEOs and take sentiment readings. So I think that, while software can give you some, to me, it's like you're looking at a picture and it gives you a bit of extra light or shade. It doesn't paint the picture. But to me, that's really, really very interesting, because often people are saying things, but they're not necessarily able to find the words to say them as clearly as what they actually mean.
Yeah.
And so analyzing things, it's kind of a bit like looking at a painting from many different angles under many different sort of light. If it's something worth looking at, you see a lot more than you do if you just stroll by and have a bit of a glance.
Yeah, I think being able to recognize those patterns, sometimes I find with people I speak to, it's what they're not saying, or it's how they're saying it, which I find is really fascinating. And then sometimes it's also just being able to know the questions to ask to kind of angle people to kind of get the information that you want to get. But it's a really fascinating experience.
So do you think in interviewing these people that there's a reticence to share the gritty truth of things?
I think that's changing, Brett. I actually think that the more that we are starting to talk about things like the mental health of founders, the more that we are starting to, I believe, realize that it's a really fine line sometimes between success and failure. And the people who have failed should be held up and sometimes, depending on how they failed, applauded for really giving it a go, because I've been there with my business, that fine line between success and failure many times over the years. So I really make pains in my books to try to include stories of failure as much as stories of success. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I think those words come with so much heavy embedded emotional impact that, to a degree, they're not that helpful. When I wrote my first book, I said it wasn't a book about success. It was a book about people who'd found a way to achieve their goals. Because when you say success, people have in their mind what that is, and who could know? I couldn't define that for everyone. But interestingly, ultimate failure is to not have the courage to pursue your ideas at all.
I think all of us have
basically a lack of courage.
Yeah, I think all of us have sliding doors moments when we look back and think, what if we didn't take that opportunity? What if we didn't act on that idea and turn it into reality? And it's not necessarily sometimes that first idea that's going to be a killer idea that is going to bring you all your riches and achieve all your goals, but it's what doors that idea opens up. And that, I just think, is a really important lesson that I've learned and you've learned over the years.
Yeah, totally. And look, your path of working and studying from a young age, I believe that it's hugely impactful to, at a young age, see people going about things. And I love that concept of 10,000 hours, and this is me probably bastardizing the research, but I have no doubt that it takes 10,000 hours to master something. I think it's worthwhile to master something. And I say to every young person, you can choose how long you take to get that 10,000 hours. You can start at 15, you can start at 14, you can start, as many Olympians start at 10. The question is, if you can find that thing, work day and night, put 10,000 hours into it or more, because you do tend to get this momentum. And when you get feedback that's positive on the thing that you're doing that you love, it is just much easier to keep going. Love that concept of the flywheel. It's ultimately other people who turn that wheel, often with their encouragement. And just to sort of finish up on that theme, there's a lot of people out there having a go. And so if you can give a kind word or an encouragement to somebody, or even give them a hard time if you don't think they're living up to their potential, you can really impact other people positively and be encouraging. I know that there's often people who wouldn't know the difference that they've made. And often it's just by being the way they are.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think with my career coming full circle, I started off being a writer in the early days and exploring that. Then that turned into running a business. And before I knew it, there was dozens of staff that I had to deal with and dealing with their problems and hiring teams of writers. And what I really love now is, having come out the other end, I've kind of gone back into what I really loved and kind of reconnected with writing and communicating and taking complicated subjects and making them simple and distilling down lessons and helping other people. And I love that kind of has come full circle for me, because it really makes me feel like I'm in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and you're able to communicate now to businesses because the people that are running those, the challenges that they face. so often now we've got a lot of people giving Elon Musk advice, and which is semi amusing if it wasn't outright hilarious, right? But who would know what it is to walk in his shoes to build a business like Tesla, one of a few that have completely and radically changed an entire global industry. It's absolutely gigantic, and the downstream impact of batteries and renewables and et cetera, et cetera. How do I couldn't give him any advice.
I'm sure he could learn some things from you, Brett.
Well, I think we can all learn from each other, but I think often, I think now with your experience, you're running 70 people. You meet somebody, I met somebody recently, with hundreds of thousands of employees, and I have no advice for that. I was just all in, so it's very interesting. It's that old one that, the wiser you get, the more you realize how little you know. Mate, it's so nice to have a chat this morning. I know you've got to run and grab a plane, and I've got to go and do the next thing, but I saw the book came out. I want to recommend and commend both Cold Status and Killer Thinking to anyone listening. Now, just a quick tip: read the intro, read the conclusion, read the last page of each chapter. Put some yellow stickies. I'm sitting here with all my I have these books of stickers that I break up a book with. Break up the book into bits. A lot of people ask me, how do you read so much? I read it in bits. You can see piles of books around. If I'm bored with that one, I read this one. I'm full of. I'm reading this little one. I'm full of these little tags. Tag up the book, right, and break it up.
I love that. I really think books, particularly my books, I want to see people scribble on them, bend them, write in them, add things to them. The books are designed to be used, and the more you do that, so I love that you figured out a system that works for you, Brett. And I encourage everyone to figure out their own system.
Get in there, guys. Don't feel like this book is some sacred object that cannot be written on. So tag it up, read it in bits, write all over it. And, as I've said to so many people, if you get one idea today that you can use, then go hard and use it, because the world has a lot of things about it that could be improved. Mate, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And get out there, guys, and buy a copy of this book, because authors need our support.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett. Great to chat and catch up.
Thanks, champion. Catch up soon.
See ya.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.